Lecture 15, The Historical Power of Biblical Stories.
Genesis and Exodus, like the Iliad of Homer, embody in themselves the values and aspirations of a very great people. The Greeks in the case of the Iliad, the Jewish people in Genesis and Exodus. I believe that as in the Iliad, so too in Genesis and Exodus, there is a very strong kernel of historical truth. And like the Iliad, Genesis and Exodus use their narrative to convey the most profound truths. Now, the Iliad is a great book, and it is one of our arguments in this course that many of the most important myths all across society give rise to great books. Are Genesis and Exodus great books? Yes. How did we define a great book? A great book has a great theme. It is written in noble language. It speaks across the ages, and it can speak to you personally. The great theme of Genesis and Exodus is the very creation of the world by a universal God and how He chooses one unique people, the people of Israel, to be His chosen nation. It is written in the most sublime poetry and prose. It is magisterial in the Hebrew, and the King James Version of the Bible conveys that same majesty. And it certainly does speak through the ages. It is, as we said, read every day, perhaps by millions, even a billion people. And it certainly speaks to individuals. It transforms individuals' lives. Does it have a strong historical kernel? And there we have said yes. It is a book, both Genesis and Exodus, which fits clearly into the historical context of the period from around 1800 BC right on down until 1200 BC, and indeed all the way down until we get into very strongly recorded history, the time of the Persian Empire in the 6th century BC. This doesn't mean, of course, that every word has to be historically documented, but the historical context is very strong in the entire Old Testament. Now, what is the meaning, though, of Genesis and Exodus? How does it define the character of the Hebrew people? It leads them to the Holy Land, and under Joshua they sweep into the Holy Land, and Israel will become first a conquering nation, then a kingdom. And the Israelites will ask God to give us a king so that we may be like other nations. Gives him King Saul and then King David. And under King David, around 1000 BC, Israel was one of the powers of the Middle East. The book of Samuel, describing the kingship of King David, ranks along with Herodotus as one of the first true histories ever written. And by a true history, I mean not what the Egyptians knew or the Assyrians knew as history, which was simply a catalog of the great deeds of a king or a pharaoh. No, history is using the past to make decisions in the present and to plan for the future. It is the historical thought that was so important in the minds of the founders of our country. And the author of Samuel precedes even Herodotus in drawing the moral lessons from history. and posing the moral question, do the private actions of a ruler have any impact upon his public actions? In other words, is there a dichotomy between private and public morality? And the book of Samuel seeks to explore this very profound truth by narrating the course of the kingship of David. It is an issue that is still with us today. We, as a society, have come essentially to the conclusion that whatever a politician does in private should not really bear upon his public duties. Now, whenever the press or any of us want to bring down a politician, then we immediately pull all of these private actions out of the closet. But when a candidate runs and the candidate says, my religious views will have no impact on what I do as a senator or congressman, well, that makes no sense to me. Why have these religious views unless they have an impact upon your actions? And the book of Samuel, the author of Samuel, unknown to us in terms of his name, asked this question. For God had raised David very, very high. And under his leadership, Israel became a power. But at the height of his power, David glanced across from his palace and saw the beautiful Bathsheba bathing. And he immediately wanted her. And he found out that she was already married to Uriah the Hittite. But nonetheless, he slept with her, and then, lest somehow she become pregnant, he ordered Uriah back from the front. Now this again gets us into real historical details. Hittite troops descended from the collapse of the Hittite Empire. There was a small Hittite region in Syria around 1000 BC, and these Hittites served as mercenaries in the army of Israel. So that's just historical fact. He calls Uriah the Hittite back from the front, tells him to go sleep with his wife. But next morning he wakes up and there's Uriah the Hittite in the courtyard, still hasn't gone to his wife, and David wants to know why, and he said, well, I'm polluted by battle and I haven't cleaned myself up. So now David takes the next step, and he sends Uriah back to the front with a message to his commander, put Uriah in the very front of the battle. In other words, see to it that he is killed. So David has committed adultery, he commits murder, and ultimately, as his punishment, his own son, Absalom, rises up against him. He's killed, the son is in the civil war, and Absalom says, and David says, as he sees his son hanging there in the tree, "Oh, Absalom, Absalom, would that I could have died for you." So, by his own private sins, David has brought this disaster upon Israel and upon himself. And that is the consistent story of the Old Testament, of a people that has been called by God and that time and time again slip away from the rigorous commandments of their God. And in the midst of this, the prophets arise. And in the Hebrew Testament, we find one of the first and most powerful statements of the demand for social justice. That government exists not just to take care of the wealthy, but that the king has a moral duty to all of his subjects. Now, this whole lesson, does it speak across the ages? The answer is yes. The founders of our country were deeply learned in the Old Testament. You just need to look at their names to see the profound impact of the Old Testament upon them. And for them, America was like a new Israel. And that is what the Puritan fathers were trying to achieve when they came to this country to be free to worship the way they wanted to. And they saw before them a whole new opportunity to create a unique nation. And for the early frontiersmen to take a very different view, this was like the land of Canaan, and they had come into the land of Canaan and would take it by fire and sword from its original inhabitants. This vision, then, of America as unique is part of our legacy from the Old Testament and the lesson of Israel. Herman Melville described the United States as the new Israel, chosen to bear the ark of the covenant of liberty to the entire world. And all through the 19th century, this sense of America and its manifest destiny was tied up with our vision of the Old Testament and America as the new Israel. But it also spoke across the ages to the Jewish people, dispersed all over Europe, finally dispersed all over the world. Every year they would look to go back to Jerusalem. And even as they went into the death camps, even as they went into the gas chambers, in their faith in God, they would sing, "Next year in Jerusalem." Now, how a profound truth can shape history is testified to the birth of the modern state of Israel. In the 19th century, there began a new movement to revitalize the Hebrew language, to turn it into a modern language, a whole movement called Zionism, with the idea of getting back to the Holy Land. And migration began. And more Jewish people moved back into what was called Palestine. And under the British mandate, during World War I itself, the British promised that they would see to the creation of a Jewish state within Palestine. But they backed away from that. Then came the terrible Holocaust. And it became clear to the Jewish people that they alone could take care of themselves. That when it came to the most crucial decisions, only they would take responsibility. Thus it was that the Jewish people began their strong movement to declare an independent Jewish state. The British were going to leave their mandate, and the question was, if the Jews proclaimed their independence, would the Arabs attack them, and would anybody protect Israel? So it was that the decision came to President Harry Truman. Now, Truman was not an openly devout person. He liked to use strong language and liked his bourbon, but he also read his Bible, and he believed deeply in the historicity of the Old Testament. Thus the question was brought to him by his foreign policy makers and the Secretary of State, George Marshall. Now, there was no public servant that Truman admired more than General Marshall. And Marshall told him that he, Marshall, was in agreement with the entire State Department that it would be a fatal mistake to recognize Israel. Truman pondered it, sat down with his Bible, called the general back in and said, "We will recognize that state. We will be one of the very first to recognize it." And he based that decision on the words of the Old Testament speaking across the ages. And he gave two reasons for his decision. Marshall, of course, prophecy was absolutely correct. But Truman believed, one, that after what the Jewish people had gone through in the Holocaust, they must have their own state. And two, he believed that God had promised them this new Israel. So we recognized Israel, and that brave nation has maintained itself as the only real democracy in the Middle East. The very essence of Judaism, whether in the Old Testament or in today, is a belief in only one God, monotheism. That makes the religion of Judaism far different from the religions of Greece and Rome or Mesopotamia. All of these are based on many gods. And in fact, if we go to the early civilization of China, the early civilization of India, these are all based upon a multitude of gods. So the question arises to us, not only is Israel unique in its vision of being a chosen people, but it is also unique in this ideal of monotheism. And out of the Jewish ideal of monotheism has come both Christianity and Islam. So it is the fount of three great religions of the world. Why? How? I would like us to go back again to the time of the Hebrews in Egypt. In the 15th and early 14th century, the Egyptian empire reached its height. Under the great conqueror Thutmose, the Egyptian empire reached all the way to the far banks of the Euphrates River, reached all the way up into Syria. Even the Hittites, in this period of the 15th century, were cowed by the might of Egypt and its powerful chariot forces. And there arose in Egypt a sense that this was now a universal empire. The height of this empire was reached under the Pharaoh Amenhotep III, dying around the year 1352. And when he passed away, his son, Amenhotep IV, underwent a conversion comparable only to that of Constantine in history, and perhaps of Ashoka with Buddhism. Constantine to Christianity, Ashoka to Buddhism, and Amenhotep IV to a monotheistic religion. As there was one empire that was the empire of all of the world that centered in Egypt, so Amenhotep began to believe that there was only one God. Now, nothing could fly more into the face of centuries of Egyptian tradition. Its multitude of gods, its gods able to assume numerous forms, its elaborate priesthood, which, as you'll recall, was exempt from paying taxes, the many temples that dotted the landscape devoted to these many divinities, sacred crocodiles, sacred fishes. But Amenhotep thought all of these were meaningless. There was only one God, and that was the Aten, the divine God that was symbolized by the great solar disk. So first he changed his name, Akhenaten, from Amun, satisfied, Amun, one of the supreme gods, to the living spirit of the Aten. His next step was to convert his family. His third step was to begin to level the temples of Egypt, remove the names of all of these offending infidel gods from the walls of the Egyptian temples, and to try to insist that everyone throughout his land of Egypt worship this god, the Aten. Now this is between 1352 and 1336. His wife, Nefertiti, known to us from a beautiful bust in the museum at Berlin, became one of his most faithful disciples. His children became his disciples, and a large group of higher officials also professed faith in the Aten. And to be away from all of the polluting atmosphere of the great city of Thebes, where so many of these temples existed, Akhenaten moved his capital far out into the desert, building a whole new city. And there he composed and had inscribed one of the most beautiful hymns ever composed. I believe in you, Aten, you are the one. When the sun arises, you in your love for the whole of humanity light up the horizon. The little birds begin to chirp when the beauty of your light first crosses the sky. The fish in the rivers jump. The working man is made happy. And as you cross the sky, you cover with your love and brightness the whole of the world. The little chicken, the little chick in the egg, you care about. You care about the sparrow who falls from a tree. You care about every child that is born. You are all loving, all great, all powerful. It has been given to me to preach your message to the world. It has been given to me to share this unique relationship with you as my personal God. The Nubian in the desert, the Syrian on the Euphrates River, they all bow before your greatness. The sun is but the symbol of your might and your love and your warmth. So this hymn to one God, while he was so concerned with preaching the message of this God of love, this God who remains holy, unlike the scandalous lives of many of the Egyptian divinities and Greek divinities, while preaching this one God of love and truth, and that too is part of the message. You are truth incarnate. But the affairs of the empire began to collapse, and we have large numbers of clay tablets again that describe the ever-worsening situation on the frontiers of Egypt. Akhenaten fails to keep up his alliances with important rulers in Syria, and there begins to be a growing unrest inside Egypt itself. For the ordinary person believed deeply in his gods of Egypt, and to the ordinary Egyptian this was simply heresy, and the priests spurred them on. A whole new age seemed to be dawning. The very new belief in Aten gave rise to a current of art that broke with all the traditions of Egyptian art. It was fluid and magical rather than being static. And some of the frescoes that adorn the palace are the most glorious examples of art. And the bust of Nefertiti, the strange images of Akhenaten, seeming to show him with both male and female qualities. All of these still remain for us in the museums of Europe and America to testify to this new spirit. But the empire crumbled. Akhenaten probably was put to death, but his own son, still as a young boy, reconverted. And the old gods of Egypt were restored, and this young boy, Tutankhamun, his name had originally been Tutankhaten, but it was changed to Tutankhamun, incorporating the name of the old traditional king of the gods, died at about the age of 18 or 19, probably not by foul means, but rather simply as a result of a fall. And he was laid to rest with the most extraordinary amount of gold and precious jewels And the discovery of that tomb in 1922 by the English archaeologist Howard Carter set off an Egyptomania that is still with us today in mummy movies that excite audiences in 2006 and 2011 just as much as they did in the years 1929 and 30. But what happened to that idea? What happened to that idea of one God? I believe that this teaching was known to the Hebrews. I believe that, in fact, as already suggested by Sigmund Freud, there may be a very real possibility that Moses himself was an Egyptian. We have at least seen how his name, Moses, is an ordinary traditional Egyptian name. 2, he flees from Egypt, comes back, and leads the Hebrew people out and teaches them this religion that has come down from the Pharaoh Akhenaten. Now, this may have correlated with what the Hebrew people had brought with them into Egypt, what they had learned with Abraham. But I think that the idea of monotheism, created there by Akhenaten, taken by the Hebrew people, correlating and perhaps with their own earlier beliefs, became this powerful force. And there is nothing stronger than an idea. Once an idea like this is started, not all of the persecution of the priest, not foreign catastrophes can put it to an end. So I think we can find a real historical kernel of truth in the idea that Akhenaten's monotheism passed on to the Hebrews and would then pass on to become the foundation of Christianity and of Islam. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet of God. Say that one time with conviction, and you will find salvation in Islam. And there, I am the Lord thy God, you shall have no other gods before me. Every Christian would attest to that, as would every Jew. So the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus, fitting fully into the historical context of the ancient Near East in the 2nd century, in the 2nd millennium, passing on down through the ages, shaped history, recreated this new state of Israel, and those same lessons of having to take the Holy Land by force of arms, those same lessons that God has given the Holy Land to Israel, the Muslim belief that it is their land, equally given to them by God. There is no set of stories, no set of higher truths that shapes our everyday world in any way comparable to this. So that is the power of a myth. That is the power of a great story. That is the power of the human imagination, the human will to keep alive all that is best, and at the same time to understand that what is best may indeed lead us into these great crises and even deeds of wrong. So myth is a powerful instrument.